Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's 3:40. Let's go. I'd like to get to our last item on our agenda for this afternoon. Um, we have, I'd like to also welcome the members of the SSC that are here to join us today for the discussion. This is Brandon. This is probably the second or third time we've had a joint meeting.
This is our third.
This is our third. Okay, great. I feel like this is a really good thing for members of the SSC and the council to interact when they typically, or when they don't often interact because of the meeting schedules and everyone's busy schedule. So this is really great. Brandon Muffley is going to walk us through a presentation. There are no real specific motions or anything needed for today, but just an opportunity to talk about priorities and where, as the council, it's our opportunity to direct the SSC on options or not options, but on things to be considering as they do the work for our council. So I do want to also recognize Dr. Paul Rago, who serves as our SSC chair at this time. So I don't know, Paul, if you had anything prepared to present, but I am going to turn to Brandon at this time, and we'll work it out. We'll figure it out.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to run the presentations, but I've coerced a few SSC members to give presentations, so I'll just run it for all of the presenters.
Oh, I see.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah,
so,
I did see that there were some SSC members in my planning summary meeting notes that there are going to be a couple different topics being discussed. So yeah, but I'm going to turn to you, Brandon, for introductions and to run that portion of the meeting. I appreciate it.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
So let me ask you before you go any further. Do you want to stop in between each of the topics for discussion? I think that might be best.
That's the way I was envisioning it when I set up the
Okay.
agenda, Mike, was that we have a short presentation by an SSC member to kind of, tee up the issue and the topic, and then have some discussion with the council before we move on to the next topic.
Okay. Yeah, that works for me. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to you to recognize the folks who are going to do the presentations. I don't have that information in front of me right now, but I'll look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And yeah, this, as Mike had indicated, this is our third time getting together, and I think it's been really productive so far. I think, as you'll see from some of the topics today, I think we're some outcomes of our previous council SSC discussions. I think we've made a lot of advances, and usually one of the goals is to get names and faces put together and have a discussion after a council meeting and talk through some things over a beer. So hopefully, next year when we have this meeting, if council, wants to hold this again, that, we'll be able to meet each other in person and talk through some things outside of the table as well. But I think things have gone really well. And so I appreciate the council and the SSC to agree to get together and talk through some of these things. So the SSC and I talked about this agenda during our July SSC meeting, and we came up with 3 different topics for the council to consider. And as Mike had mentioned and was in sort of the briefing memo, we selected August as the meeting to hold this, to really begin to think about priorities and sort of objectives and goals for next year for both the council and the SSC. What all are you all thinking about? How can we remain engaged? How can the SSC continue to do the work that the council is looking for? And what sort of advice the SSC can provide you all in terms of strategic planning and thinking about your priorities for the next year. And so part of the presentations that you'll hear today is sort of tee up some of those things to get feedback from the council on what kinds of activities you may want the SSC to get engaged in going forward. So thank you for that. And so we have 3 presentations. The first one is going to cover our SSC, our economic work group. And so that's going to be led by the chair of that committee, Garrett DePiper. Then we're going to have a discussion on advancing ecosystem science, and that's going to be led by Sarah Gachis. She is the chair of our newly formed ecosystem working group. And then the last one, and Paul had touched upon this during the mackerel discussion, we're going to have some discussions about mackerel rebuilding and sort of the science and policy considerations, and Paul's going to lead us through that presentation. So I really appreciate the three of them putting all of these materials together and stepping through the presentations. And so with that, I will be quiet and turn it over to Garrett.
Thanks, Brandon. Can you hear me?
I got you.
All right. Mr. Chairman, members of the council, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks, Brandon. So before we get into the meat of the presentation today, I do want to kind of recognize and thank both Dr. Mark Holliday and Dr. Jorge Holzer, who provided most of the slide deck that you'll be seeing today. And so thank you very much on my behalf for the effort that you put into that. Next slide. Just some quick background. You might recall that the council engaged the SSC's economic work group and the research set-aside redevelopment initiative at a vote in the December 2020 council meeting. And the ultimate goal was to allow the SSC's economic expertise to weigh in on priorities that the council had. And specifically with respect to the RSA program, really the question we're trying to answer or inform is, should the council restart the RSA program? The Research Steering Committee identified 3 research set-aside foci to generate workshops around: the research priorities, the funding and enforcement topics. And the economic work group has structured itself in terms of subgroups to support each of those foci. So for the research priorities, Dr. Mark Holliday is leading that work group. For funding, it was Dr. Jorge Holzer, and then for enforcement, it's Dr. Lee Anderson. And the main goal here is to work in step with the Research Steering Committee in order to support the exploration of these topics. As I mentioned, there's 3 virtual workshops centered around those RSA foci, and then 1 in-person meeting scheduled later in this fall to really work through what the recommendations of the Research Steering Committee would be to the council writ large. And the economic work group's role is really supporting the RSC in this process by identifying key concepts, economic concepts, and ensuring that those are explored appropriately through the stakeholder engagement process. And ultimately, we'll be providing a final written report to the council, which will be delivered in conjunction with the Research Steering Committee's recommendations. Next slide, please. So the Research Steering Committee identified a main goal for the workshops themselves, and that's to develop recommendations with insight provided from the list of participants and members of the public outlining how a revised RSA program can be successful. The economic work group's goal is really to ensure that, as I mentioned, economic considerations are fully explored during those workshops, and ensure that both the stakeholders and the Research Steering Committee has an opportunity to kind of weigh in and provide their thoughts on those issues. Next slide, please. Workshop 1 was held in July 15th to be specific, and it was focused on that research topic. And again, Mark Holliday led that endeavor. And the way that we engaged as an economic work group was as follows. We identified a lot of really important issues around the RSA program, both historically and in consideration of any redevelopment. But really 10 issues really bubbled to the top with respect to both their importance to the historical program, as well as really having the most relevant economic consequences associated with them in terms of a redevelopment of the RSA program. We only presented 5 of those during the workshop themselves due to time constraints, but all 10 of those topics will be included in the final report to the council. Next slide, please. So the way that we engaged in that workshop was we used a facilitated 10 to 15 minute conversation with the workshop participants. And that was structured in a common approach across all those topics. The topics were supported by a written one-pager, which were linked in the background documents that you were provided in preparation of this this session. And basically, both the one-pager and the presentation focused around defining the issue, summarizing past RSA experience with that issue, and then any recommendations from an economic standpoint with actually broader than economics, but core to economics with respect to what should be considered when evaluating whether to redevelop the RSA program. So SSC authors gave 3 to 5 minute overview and then facilitated the discussion around that topic. Next slide, please. So these are the presentations for that workshop. The first was consistency with stated council plans and objectives. This is specific to research topics and projects, linkages to management goals for those topics, and then application of benefit cost principles and proposal evaluation. And that was led by Dr. Mark Holliday. Dr. Olaf Jensen presented an overview of peer review and principal investigator communications, both before, during, and after completion of RSA programs or projects. I presented a discussion or facilitated a discussion around conflict of interest and its importance in mitigating conflicts of interest in redeveloping an RSA program. Presentation 4 was led by Dr. Yan Yao and focused on data access and transparency, which are key components to NOAA's science plan and best practice in science more broadly. And then presentation number 5 focused on decoupling allowances from the research being undertaken, pros and cons associated with that, and then implications for that decision on the potential, say, for example, of supporting research on forage fish and other key ecosystem species. Dr. Holzer developed the products around that discussion, but during the workshop itself, it was facilitated by myself. Next slide, please. Quick overview of the next workshop. It's scheduled for August 31st, 2021. And again, it's going to be focused on financing. We had an original plan that's deviated a little bit from our current plan, and I want to kind of give some background and context to that, so to ensure that the council understands, why the decisions were made the way that they were made. And so our original plan consisted of a description of the original auctions that were run by NFI for the quota supporting RSA program, and then a comparison of that to, say, other mechanisms such as the SCALA program, that's the RSA program that's managed out of the New England Fisheries Management Council. The next step would have been to estimate harvesters' willingness to pay based off of the auction data. So how much do fishermen value the quota for? And that would have been conducted for quota of at least a couple of species. And then we would have used that data to simulate revenue generation and allocata of quota across a couple of different mechanisms. So a fixed price offer, such as what's used in the SCALA program versus different auction formats, and compare and contrast the results under those different those constructs. The next step would have been to estimate jointness in production. The idea here is that for some species, and say, for example, black sea bass and summer flounder, certain sectors of the fishery catch those jointly. And so there might be some benefits to coupling or bundling that quota in the quota market. And the hope would have been to explore that additional value that might have been generated in that way. The idea is that you can't take a summer flounder trip. For certain people can't take summer flounder trips unless they can also catch black sea bass on that same trip. And so the value of the bundle might have been larger than the value of the individual quota. And we would have explored that. And then the final component would have been a discussion of the pros and cons of a fixed price offer versus an auction format. Next slide, please, Brandon. The updated plan is a result of the fact that we never received access to the original data set with respect to the auction. And so we had to kind of redefine what those outputs would have been that we're going to provide to the council. So we're still going to do the description of the historical auctions versus something like the scallop program. We'll still go through examples of revenue generation and allocation of quota under a fixed price offer versus auction formats. But instead of using the realized values from the historical auction, we'll have to use a made-up distribution of those values. And this is unfortunate because context matters. And so although we can still provide some input with respect to theory and guidance with respect to theory, it would have been a much more valuable exercise if we could have provided very context-specific analyses in terms of the trade-off between these markets. And again, the final product will still be a discussion of the pros and cons of fixed price offers versus auctions, but it will be theoretical and kind of strategic as opposed to more tactical that we were hoping to provide. Next slide, please. Workshop number 3 is focused on enforcement. And again, that work group lead is Dr. Lee Anderson. The workshop's scheduled for October 14th. And the work group is really, in this one, as opposed to the first 2 workshops, playing more of a supporting role to other leads, to OLE in particular, and to the regional office. But we'll be developing supporting material in line with the other workshops, although that supporting material hasn't been defined as of yet. Next slide, please. So looking forward, the economic work group really feels like we've been being able to provide some value to the process, and the economic expertise, I think, has been elucidating issues that might otherwise not have gone unnoticed through the conversations with the research steering committee. And so we would like to continue to engage with the council in a format similar to this. If the council agrees, the work group would really like to align any transition to new work with the discussion and selection of priorities by the council. But I do want to note, as I mentioned with respect to the auction format, that data access can really impact the ability of us to provide economic advice to the council. And so that availability is likely to play a really important role in vetting future topics. And again, that's because, although we can provide economic theory in terms of strategic guidance, context matters. And so empirical analysis will always be an important consideration when providing advice. And it's important not only because it provides context, but also to ensure that there's parity between what the council's getting in terms of biological advice as well as economic advice. And with that, next slide, please. I'll finish my presentation and open up for questions with a thank you to the work group whose names you see on this slide.
Garrett, thank you so much for your presentation. Let me go ahead and see if there are any members of the council that have any questions or comments regarding the information you presented. Go ahead, Chris Moore. Dr. Moore, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Garrett. Thanks for the presentation. I'm curious about a couple things. So just going back to the points that you made related to the auction, it sounded like you're very disappointed that you couldn't get some of the information that you thought you should have been able to get. And I'm just curious exactly what the deal is, to be blunt, in terms of, is it the lack of availability of that information? Is it that doesn't exist anymore? Or, what's the deal?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Moore. The issue is that the auctions, as many of you know, were conducted under a third party, and there were never any considerations to data sharing given when the original construct was developed. And actually, the council and NOAA were not part of the original contract between the NFI who ran the auctions and the individual researchers who were awarded the quota. And as from NSI's point of view, because there's potential that there is confidentiality issues around that data, they were unwilling to give us the primary data. And so we unfortunately, we never were able to kind of fully develop the statistical models and approaches that we had hoped to do. And so this is actually one thing that we'd like to write into a best practices as part of that white paper. Again, historically, these contracts have been with third parties, but the point here is that the information associated with these auctions is valuable, and consideration should be given to making sure that that's available to the council in the future. For example, information associated with the quota value between sectors, between the recreational sector versus the commercial sector, could be very informative for things like when you're discussing sector allocations. That data was kind of available associated with the historical auctions, but again, because of confidentiality concerns, it was never made available.
Thank you, Garrett. Mr. Chair, can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, please go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so Garrett, listening to you explain what happened with the data request and why you weren't really able to do the more detailed analysis that you would have liked, really, just thinking out loud in terms of what our next steps might be. So as you're relaying that information and you're talking about, some of the best practices as we develop, the potential for RSA, and we start thinking about an auction again. And certainly, the major part of that would be the SOP, the standard operating practices and procedures associated with any auction. So if we looked at it slightly differently and we said to you, hey, Garrett, come up with the ideal way to deal with an auction for RSA, that might be a different sort of task, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, you would like that microeconomic data to be able to kind of inform that decision. But at the same time, the other component that you need to understand is exactly what the objectives are of the RSA program. Obviously, there's an objective of raising revenue for the research, but there's alternative objectives as well. There's equity concerns. There's other issues that the council might want to build into that process. And so with that microeconomic data and with the full list of those objectives that are looking to be met through the council, say, for example, additional confidence through engagement of researchers, confidence in the science through engagement of researchers and fishermen in the development of that science, that could inform the direction or the exact design of that market or the auction, say, for example. So we can still provide best practices, but we can't give more tactical advice in this context.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for those questions. I'm going to ask a question of Garrett. Thanks for the presentation. So is it the third party that is the hindrance, I guess, to acquiring the information you need? Are they, I have staff here in my office in Maryland that can gain access to information that's confidential, but they have to categorize it as that when they present it in a report. But I'm trying to figure out how you guys can get that information. Or is it just, are you being told that it's not possible?
Yeah, so we've gained information through the regional office already, based on the participants and their activities in the water. What we're missing from this endeavor is really the bids themselves. And so if we had been able to link the bids to the participation, we would have been able to really have a better sense as to how people were valuing their quota. And that would inform those trade-offs across the different mechanisms, like I said, a fixed price, say, for example, versus an auction. But since the only place that data exists is with the third party, with NFI, and since NFI kind of deemed it outside the scope of what was originally agreed upon with the participants in the auction, they felt that it was against their best interest to share that data. And the interest.
Yeah. Okay. All right. No, I appreciate that response. I don't know if there's anything we can do to maybe make that information available. It's outside of the realm that I'm comfortable with, but it's difficult when you're trying to do a job and you can't get the information you need. So I appreciate the work that you did, and I want to say sorry for not being able to get the information you need to work it all the way through. Let me see who we have. Michelle Duvall, I see your hand up. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a question, really just a comment, just to note that as a 1-year-old council member, I've really appreciated the contributions of the economic work group to, the research steering committee workshops. I felt like the first workshop went really well, and that the format that the SSC had suggested for the presentations of these different topics also worked really well. And I'm definitely supportive of continuing to engage with the workshop and the approach that's proposed here on the screen with respect to future engagement that's aligned with our priorities. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Appreciate the comment. Is there anybody else from the council that wants to offer a comment or has a question regarding this portion of the agenda? Chris Moore, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. While the folks are thinking about another question or two, I just wanted to point out and emphasize what Michelle just referenced, which is, and what's on the slide here, which is the 2022 priorities. So especially for the new folks, we'll be thinking about what we plan to do for 2022 here shortly as we ramp up for that discussion at our October council meeting. And at that particular meeting, the executive committee will meet to consider draft priorities, largely driven from staff discussions that we bring forward to the executive committee and then bring forward to the council in December. So I think that we as a council should take advantage of this offer and certainly look at our priorities as from this perspective of incorporating this economic work group into what potentially could be a number of priorities for 2022. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. I appreciate you bringing that up, especially for the new folks who may have been paying attention, but not part of the process over the years. Thanks for bringing that up, Chris. I appreciate it. Anyone else from the council have any questions for Garrett at this time, or any comments they want to make? Is there anyone from the public that would like to make any comments regarding the presentation that was given? Okay, I don't see any hands coming up at this time. Dr. DePiper, thank you for your presentation. I'm going to go back to Brandon for an introduction to the next section of this meeting. But thank you very much. and it's a work in progress. Hopefully we'll be able to with the council try to figure out how to get the information you need to help inform management. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thanks for your time today. So I'm going to go back to Brandon at this point to introduce the next section. Go ahead, Brandon.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to wrap up the last discussion, and so I'll continue. I think Chris laid it out really well as we begin to think about priorities for 2022. I'll continue to work with the working group, given sort of the general satisfaction by the council to keep this working group engaged in your activity. So I'll be sure to touch base with the working group. And once we have those list of priorities, we can sort of relay that information back to the council in terms of the working group's thoughts on potential priorities and engagement for 2022. So I think that was a really good discussion. So thanks. And so the second topic.
So before you go any further, Brandon,
yep.
Maybe I can ask Chris, or maybe you can answer it. I don't know if you guys have had this conversation, but we work through those priorities each year. Do you think, Chris, are these priorities going to be its own kind of is it going to be like its own concept, like its own topic? We work through those priorities and we move things around and we put things in the bin that, if we can do it, we can do it. If we can't do it, we're not going to do it. How do you see this? How do you see this work with the SSC falling out?
So I think the short answer would be maybe, but not necessarily. So there might be a very specific project that we ask the economic work group to take on, or there might be a situation where we have an ongoing project or another project that involves them, just like they're working with this RSA committee on that particular project. So I think it could be a combination of things. So again, it'll be driven by the conversations that I have with staff regarding the things that they're thinking about for 2022, and then we'll bring it forward to the executive committee. And certainly, as we start developing those documents and thinking about it, we'll be reaching out to a number of folks for ideas and things that they think we should do in 2022 as well. So stay tuned.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks, Chris. It just helps me wrap my mind around how this is all gonna play out. I appreciate it. Thank you. So I'm gonna go. Let's go back to Brandon. Go ahead, Brandon.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So our second topic, again, is in part with a working group. Dr. Rago had brought this up at a couple of council meetings ago after you all get your State of the Ecosystem report. The SSC also gets the State of the Ecosystem report in March ahead of your April council meeting. And so there's been a lot of discussion about how to sort of advance and sort of operationalize has been the word we've been using to operationalize the information within that State of the Ecosystem report within the council process, within the SSC process. And so how can we sort of incorporate more ecosystem information into our decision-making processes? So the SSC formed an ecosystem work group and to talk about all of those things and come up with a game plan for you all. And so there's lots of areas to go here, and Dr. Gachis is going to present on sort of all of those sort of thinkings and where the work group was last week when they met for the first time. And so I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Brandon. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sound good.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. It's nice to speak with you this afternoon. I appreciate the time that you're taking to look at this topic. So I'll be just in contrast to the group that Garrett was just talking about, the basically ecosystem working group for the SSC has just been formed and has met exactly once, like Brandon just said, and it was last week. So the group members are myself, Garrett DePiper, Gavin Fay, Dave Secor, Mike Wilberg, Rob Latour, Wendy Gabriel, Yan Zhao, and Paul Rago. And many of them are on the call today, so thank you for joining the call. And my thought with this presentation was to keep it fairly brief, give you an idea of what the working group might be doing. We have met once again, like I said, and are building a proposal to the full SSC to be presented in September of what some of our first tasks might be. But this is an excellent time for the council to weigh in. And so really the purpose of this, there's only 2 slides here, is to have a discussion with the council and get your feedback early in the process. And so the idea here is to make better use of the existing ecosystem information that gets presented each year, and also to develop more tailored products that may not exist yet and processes to use this information in management. So you have your existing EAFM process. I'd say that the Mid-Atlantic Council is probably ahead of many councils, if not all of them, with respect to getting and using ecosystem information. You do your risk assessment every year. You've done a conceptual model. You're part of the way through a management strategy evaluation. There's multiple other issues, ecosystem issues that the council has worked on. So the idea here is really to not to stop doing any of that, but to think more about how to use some of the information that's presented each year and some information that we have but maybe isn't presented that would help you make different management decisions. And so possible tasks for the working group would include something as simple as reviewing and prioritizing the current ecosystem indicator work. So things like analyzing indicators or the way species are grouped in the report, or looking at thresholds for indicators, which the council has mentioned before, for the upcoming State of the Ecosystem report, or for prototype stock specific reports that are just going to be produced. Well, there's some prototypes already, and there's actually a workshop going on right now at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center discussing how to basically report ecosystem information at the stock level that could be useful to stock assessments, either within the model or as accessory information. And so that's also just developing now, and it's a great time for both the SSC and the council to think about what they might like to see there to help in the management process. So as was brought up in our meeting last week, I'm a scientist, and I'm the first person to say I might think of something that's really cool science and want to pursue that in the ecosystem. But if it doesn't actually help you with one of your management decisions, then I'm not getting you what you need. And so what we really want to think about management outcomes and management decisions and focus our ecosystem work on that. Another possible task is to develop and test decision frameworks that use ecosystem information in setting acceptable biological catch, or ABC, for individual stocks. And one topic that the SSC already does every single time we set an ABC is we go through our overfishing limit, OFL-CV, coefficient of variation process, to determine the scientific uncertainty that we think is in the overfishing limit, so that we can help the council apply their risk policy to make sure that overfishing doesn't happen. So when there's higher scientific uncertainty, basically the ABC becomes lower. When there's lower scientific uncertainty, the ABC can become higher, closer to the OFL. And so this is a process that we already use, and there is an ecosystem criterion in it. And at present, we are using it, but I think the group felt we could be using it in a more structured way. We could develop better criteria for that, etc. So this is one of the possibilities we'll be bringing forward to the full SSC in September. And so it would be the idea of just further clarifying and developing that process. And one thing I want to emphasize with the OFL-CV process is it's not always a ratchet down. It isn't always an ecosystem factor makes the ABC go down. There's a possibility that uncertainty is decreased and the ABC would actually be higher. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, it is not the idea to use ecosystem information to always move things in one direction, but just to better assess scientific uncertainty, productivity of the system, and make sure that we're making our best informed decisions. And then, of course, a broader category of things that the SSC working group could be helping with is scientific support for the Mid-Atlantic Council's review and update of the EAFM risk assessment, and for the council's use of the state of the ecosystem and risk assessment and strategic planning. So what you were just talking about, the SSC could be using some of this ecosystem information to help you support those decisions. Okay, Brandon, you can go to the next slide, please. And so really the rest of the time here, I think we would love to get council feedback on this idea, since the group has just formed and the council gets the State of the Ecosystem report every year, and obviously gets reports on all of the stock status every single year as well. What sort of information or data or tools or approaches might be missing that would be informative to help you support your decision making and strategic planning and priority setting. So this would be for both management and research. And not to prescribe anything, but just to give a couple of examples, and then we'll stop and have a discussion. So there are a couple of other places, in addition to what the Mid-Atlantic Council already does with the EAFM approach, where other councils and agencies have used ecosystem information in decision-making. One of them is the North Pacific Fishery Management Council's process. So they've had these ecosystem status reports, which are a bit longer, but contain a lot of the same information as the SOE that the Mid-Atlantic Council gets. They have used these reports to inform the OFL and ABC setting for upcoming years. And so a couple of papers were in your background material there. One instance happened when I actually worked at the Alaska Fishery Science Center. So the Bering Sea pollock quota for 2006 was, there were two possibilities for the ABC, a higher and a lower. And the Council and SSC looked at both the stock information and the ecosystem information that was indicating sort of an unfavorable year for Bering Sea pollock in terms of both temperature and in terms of zooplankton productivity. These were all presented in the ecosystem report. So in combination with the stock assessment, they actually chose the lower of the two possibilities in 2006. I think this happened one more time, but it's since I've left, so please don't quote me on that, I'm not sure. The other example is for Gulf of Alaska cod, which you're seeing the two images in the bottom of the slide. So there was a huge marine heat wave in the Gulf of Alaska in 2015, and the image on the lower left-hand side there of your figure is showing that this is time on the x-axis and depth in the water on the y-axis. And red is warmer, as usual, in these plots. And so it was showing like abnormally high temperatures from about 2014 through 2015, 2016, even into almost into 2017. And it went all the way down through the water column. It was really unusual. And there were a lot of ecosystem impacts to this. There were also changes in Gulf of Alaska cod condition, there were changes in zooplankton, there were changes in seabirds, and all of this was reported in the ecosystem reports that the Alaska Center puts out. But they didn't really see it coming that Gulf of Alaska cod would be hit so hard. So this information was actually used somewhat retrospectively to say, okay, now we understand why the bottom fell out from cod in 2017 when we were actually thinking they would be going higher based on previous projections. They did lower their quotas in 18 and 19, even a little bit more than the stock assessment recommended as the maximum possible due to these ecosystem conditions, and they did have an explanation. But I think even the North Pacific Council is looking for maybe more predictive ways to use this information. So that's one example. And a second example is linked. It's a website that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife uses. So they look at habitat compression as well as forage indices to think about to use in their risk assessment and mitigation program for multiple protected species, humpback whales, blue whales, leatherback turtles. And so there's a whole website there that basically outlines the information. And I'm not going to walk you through it because we don't have the time, but it might be interesting to look at. And this is a little more similar to your risk assessment. So it's not really a decision on quota for a managed species, but it is looking at risk to other species that we have objectives for and using the ecosystem information in a structured way. And so I won't belabor this anymore, but I will stop here. And I will also thank the members of the working group for their great discussions at the meeting last week. And I will look forward to more of those. And at the moment, we'd love to hear the feedback of the council on what sort of directions you would like to see. Thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm going to go first to, I have a question myself, but let's see where other council members might be able to offer you some thoughts. I have Michelle Duvall with her hand up. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Sarah, for the presentation. So I don't know that I'm actually going to provide any information in response to your question. It was really in response to the 3 bullets that were on the previous slide, but I was really excited about, the second one, which was, decision frameworks to use ecosystem information and setting ABCs, and, appreciated the examples that you gave from the North Pacific. And then I was also, interested in, one sentence in the briefing materials really stuck out for me, which was, providing advice on the use of ecosystem information and estimating reference points and parameters for rebuilding depleted stocks. Because, obviously, that's one of the topics we've discussed earlier this afternoon. And I think, especially when we face situations where, we receive our scientific advice, we set up a rebuilding plan, and even when we exceed the requirements of a rebuilding plan with respect to harvest, we get surprised by some of these other indicators like recruitment that, present a much more depressing, I can't think of another word at this point, picture of where we are. So, those are things that I'm definitely interested in and would be really excited to see you guys work on further. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Appreciate those thoughts and comments. I was wondering, as you, Sarah, as you went through this presentation, maybe this is a question more for Brandon. As we work through our climate scenario planning, how is the SSC, is there a plan to have the SSC part of that discussion? I'm not familiar with all the details about how the SSC might be involved, and especially the the group that Sarah's discussing here.
I will let Brandon answer that, but I would welcome any support we can provide to that. So go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah.
I don't know what the formal plan is yet at present, though.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know the formal plan per se either. I mean, I certainly think there's an avenue and a role for the SSC. I don't think, certainly I've participated in some of the discussions with the core team that's really driving a lot of the scenario planning work. I don't think there has been specific discussions about the SSC. But I think, thinking about now that we do have this work group, sort of steered up, but also thinking that scenario planning covers the entire Atlantic coast, so 3 councils. And so how we would engage all the different SSCs and things like that, I think we would need to think through, but I certainly think there's an avenue for sort of engagement. I try to bring up all of our different ecosystem activities in front of the SSC just to keep them up to speed on what we're working on. And so certainly at a minimum, presenting the scenario planning work to the SSC during some sort of meeting, upcoming meeting, I think would be beneficial in getting some feedback there. But we're still pretty early on in the process with the scenario planning. We're just going out for public scoping here at the end of the month. So yeah, so I'm happy to take any feedback, and I can bring that back to the core team for their thoughts and present that back to the NRCC if we needed to.
Yeah. Okay. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think this work, this group that's together could be somebody. It could be a group that we can work with the information that they can provide to help us through that process. Chris Moore has his hand up. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Sarah. Yeah, I agree with Brandon in terms of utilizing this group with the whole scenario planning idea. As Brandon indicated, we're just getting really started. We have the scoping process we're going to embark on here shortly. So this is perfect timing, right, to really introduce the idea of having this group involved with that particular exercise. And I think it would be perfect. I think it'd be an excellent thing for you guys to do. So we will follow up with you, Sarah, and Brandon can bring the idea to the core team as well. I'm not sure when that core team meets again. I think everyone recognizes that the key staffer involved with the scenario planning exercise just had a baby, so she's busy doing baby stuff and won't be directly involved with this for a while. So Brandon's our guy at this point. So that's one thing. And yes, again, great idea. And Brandon will follow up with you on that. The other one is this example, number one, right? In terms of the North Pacific Council, I understand uses the reports to inform OFL and ABCs for upcoming years. What if, we kind of dabbled in this a little bit, and dabble's probably not the right word, and Brandon probably wouldn't appreciate that. But I think in terms of how this would work, Sarah, could we actually explore this relative to what we do from a Mid-Atlantic Council perspective? And if we do, how would it work? I mean, where would we start?
Thanks for the question. It's an excellent question. I think from my perspective, the most direct way into ABC setting right now with our current processes is to look at that ecosystem portion of the OFL CV criteria that the SSC already has. So we would be asking the question, what is anything in the ecosystem either likely to be increasing or decreasing the scientific uncertainty in the OFL? So that's one thing that I think the SSC could pretty much jump on right now, because the process is already there and it already directly informs ABC. Now, the question would be, can we figure out which of these many indicators? So there's a lot of indicators in Alaska. We have a lot of the same ones. We have fish condition, we have, temperature anomalies, we have heat waves. It's a lot of the same stuff. There was a really nice paper looking at the combination of things that actually caused Gulf of Alaska cod to drop. And so you can base some ideas of uncertainty on analyses in other areas. So if you see temperature go up and their metabolism go up and their energy needs go up at the same time as their prey are going down, so there's a sort of food web energetic argument for why their production may be suffering. There's also things like, have they shifted out of the area? There's a lot of different angles on this. And I think a lot of people already understand the complexity of this, but I think it would be possible for the SSC to go down the road of clarifying what are the specific things we would want to look at for each stock, and are those indicators at the ecosystem level already and in the state of the ecosystem report, or do we need something special for a particular stock? But there's already a process there. So that's uncertainty. So you take the OFL from wherever you got it, the stock assessment, and then you would buffer to the ABC with the uncertainty. The other avenue that the group discussed was trying to basically advise on and assist with any process that helps bring ecosystem information directly into an assessment. Now, that's not directly under the purview of the SSC, but I think that is the sort of thing the SSC would love to encourage. And I think there's a lot of people working on this already. Obviously, we've seen many stock assessments that have included things like thermal habitat, et cetera. And so it would just be trying to figure out how to make those processes work more efficiently, because doing a stock assessment is a huge amount of work. And so the idea is not to continue to burden or overburden people, but to make things more streamlined. So that's another avenue that would directly affect this. And the third avenue is kind of what the North Pacific Council has actually sort of looked at all the indicators and decided, okay, we're going to actually lower the ABC by a certain amount because we've seen that things aren't looking good for that stock. And so it's an ad hoc approach is probably a little too harsh sounding for that, because they are using all the information they have. So there's no need to have the council can decide to have a process that is really quantitative, or one that's more, we see these signs and we want to take these actions. And again, it doesn't have to be lowering, it could be increasing. We think maybe we have a climate winter, or the productivity of some stock is going up. So maybe things could, look a little better. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but there are at least two avenues, and one is directly into the stock assessment by encouraging those processes, and the other is just with the OFL CV process. I hope that helps. Happy to clarify.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. So just to recap, we have an idea of a process, and we have, you guys in the group have been talking about the different ways that you can be involved in this particular aspect of council work, OFLs and ABCs. But I'm wondering if it might be something for the group to do as it relates to actually identifying the process. you know, so I've kind of, I don't know if I've confused you now, but in terms of, you know, how it would work, right? So you mentioned a couple of things there. You know, we have sort of a direct and indirect way of looking at this, and maybe it is a more direct way that I'm looking for, which says basically, you know, we have the state of the ecosystem, you know, data. We have this report that we give every year. Here's the important parts of it as it relates to ABC setting, and this is how it should be incorporated into how those ABCs are set, right? Which is a much, I think, you know, a more defined process than what we currently have. And I think from my perspective, that would be something that would be useful to the council and to the SSC as it goes forward with all our ABC stuff. But, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that, you know, sounds good to me anyway. And certainly, you know, the important part of what you just said is it can go either way. You know, people freak out when they think about, oh, you know, we're going to be looking at these ABCs from an ecosystem perspective, and that means that they're going to go down. They could actually go the other way. So I think that's another important part of the message. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so just to clarify, this would be separate from the OFLCV and uncertainty process. This would be, because another thing the group discussed was looking sort of more in aggregate or holistically across multiple indicators and saying, you know, maybe there's multiple species that are actually going to be benefited by a certain aspect of the ecosystem that we're seeing from the indicators here. And so for those, perhaps that whole group of species, the ABC could be higher. You know, in reverse, there's perhaps a whole group of species that are really going to suffer under the conditions that we're seeing in the ecosystem report. So for those, you would go in the other direction. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about? So it's separate from the uncertainty?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I think you know, we could talk about this for a while. So maybe it's something that I need to explore with Brandon, then he can bring it back to the group, and certainly we can have that additional discussion with the council about it as well.
That sounds great. Thank you for helping clarify. I look forward to more discussions on that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thanks, Sarah, for the back and forth on that. I have another hand right now, Kate Wilkie. Go ahead, Kate.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just raising my hand to say +1 to that discussion that Dr. Moore and Dr. Geitjes just had. And I think that would be a great idea to explore. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think based on what Chris just said, you know, Chris and Brandon can have that discussion, and then we can bring it back to the council. We don't need to make any decisions on where that's going today, but I think it's definitely something to explore. So I appreciate that from everybody's point of view during that discussion. Are there any other members of the council that have anything else that have anything that they would like to either comment on or ask a question of Sarah at this time before we move on? Michelle Duval, go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one more quick question. Sarah, do you know, are there any examples of, you know, stock rebuilding plans that have taken these ecosystem considerations into account in any fashion, qualitative or quantitative?
Another excellent question, and off the top of my head, no, but Paul Rago knows a lot more about rebuilding plans than I do, and he may have some ideas. Not to put you on the spot, Paul, but you are talking next. That's something that we can look at, though, and I can go back and see what I can find on that, because it does seem like ecosystem conditions have some bearing on your, you know, several years out projections. So I can look. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Michelle, and thanks for your honesty there, Sarah. We'll see. I'd like to let me quickly go out to the public. Does anyone have anything? Anyone from the public have any questions they want to ask Dr. Geitjes at this point before we move on? And again, there'll be an opportunity once we conclude with the third presentation. Hopefully everybody is staying online, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the conclusion before we adjourn for the day. Seeing nothing at this point, Sarah, thanks. It's great to hear from you. and I appreciate your presentation and the conversation back and forth with members of the council. I'm going to go back now to Brandon, who's going to introduce the third part of this discussion here today. So if you're ready, Brandon, go ahead.
Yep, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the feedback there. Again, many of the ecosystem work group folks are on the line and listening in, but we can, and when I have, additional discussions with Chris, I can take all of that sort of information back to that work group and let them kick the tires and think about things, and all of those outcomes from the ecosystem work group will go to the full SSC and back to the council. So you'll definitely have opportunities to weigh in on where they're going with those. So I appreciate that. And so maybe this will get a little bit to Michelle's questions. One of the topics that the SSC sort of struggled with and talked about a lot during their July meeting was stock rebuilding. So, we had to deal with mackerel and bluefish and sort of the different approaches and different situations that might be taking place. And for many folks, staff included, myself, I'm speaking to anyway, dealing with rebuilding plans is relatively new, and we don't have to deal with it, thankfully, very often in the Mid-Atlantic, but sort of thinking through all of the implications and processes that you may want to consider in regards to stock rebuilding. There are many sort of things that intersect with the risk policy and our control rules and how you can rebuild and what flexibility you have under Magnuson and all of those different things and how they intersect the policy and management considerations. And so after the July SSC meeting, I think the SSC was interested in having some additional discussions about rebuilding, and Paul was, instead of having this discussion tomorrow, was willing to, bring this up as a topic to discuss today. So I appreciate Paul. So Paul Rago is going to cover the stock rebuilding and science and policy considerations. So Paul, turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Brandon. Appreciate the opportunity. Again, just to answer Sarah's question, I think probably Southern New England yellowtail flounder was probably a stock where ecosystem considerations factored directly in terms of revising the status of that resource. And it was primarily related to conditions inshore that resulted in very low recruitment levels and ratios that were highly suggestive of an ecosystem change. But that's really the only one that comes to mind immediately. The next slide there, Brandon. First, thank you all for all the members of my colleagues from the SSC who are attending this, and I think these discussions have been and will continue to be, very productive. So I guess I'd start out with the thesis that, rebuilding is probably the most difficult task in fisheries science and management. And we've just, in the last few days, we've seen how extraordinarily difficult it can be. For example, with bluefish, you fall a little bit below the threshold level, and then all of a sudden you have to get a rebuilding plan that puts you into a place, hopefully and desirably, at a place that's twice as high as the place you just came from. So you've got to get to BMSY, which is typically twice the threshold level. In the other instance, mackerel, where the stock is now perceived as highly depleted, and it looks like a long road ahead in terms of restructuring management in order to achieve that goal. But I'm fully aware of the notion that you like a firewall between science and management. You want more objectivity in recommendations, such that you're not having other factors sort of contaminate the process, so to speak. But in this case, it is like the shotgun wedding. You've got two groups that are forced to be together, and under circumstances neither one's really had wanted in the first place. And so also, these two processes, science and management, are inseparable in terms of this, and neither one alone is going to to be sufficient. So, you know, you're striking a balance between your underlying knowledge of what you think the stock does and all the sets of legal requirements under National Standard 1, under the national standards, excuse me, the management goals that are in place, and then also risk policy. You know, how cautious do we want to be along the way? There's a lot of paths for rebuilding. In fact, there's an infinite number of paths, but some of them may be better economically, and so there's a general, I think, belief that you know, you could probably do better rebuilding plans if we brought in some of the economic considerations. So what we're proposing is that we would, you know, appreciate further discussion with the council, with managers, and perhaps broadening it beyond the Mid-Atlantic Council to talk about some of these issues, and to allow the SSC to be able to respond in real time. You noticed in the write-up of the macro discussions that, you know, essentially we were stuck. You know, there were a lot of scenarios that were initially developed, but then at the end of the day, there were so many things that needed to be decided that were apart from the science. They're actually policy decisions that, you know, wasn't able to go forward. The council made some good progress earlier today in terms of refining that, and we hope that we can, you know, refine that further. But, you know, these statutory guidelines for rebuilding start and end dates are one aspect of it, but they're not the only ones. And we can, you know, try to say, okay, what likelihood or what probability of rebuilding is desirable. That is not a science question. That is a management and societal issue. You know, we use the council risk policy for interim guidance, and for bluefish, for example, it became clear that that average F that allows you to achieve a rebuilding target is in fact treated like an FMSY proxy during that period, conditional on the size of the resource. And so we applied the rebuilding, or excuse me, the OFLCV process in order to evaluate that. Next slide, please. Another key aspect is, you know, what if conditions change during rebuilding? You know, we structure these things. We have the hubris to you know, say that we expect values of future recruitment and continuation of existing growth rates and maturation rates, and no changes in the discard patterns. But that's not reality. So reality can be, let's just take one instance where recruitment can be very low. You know, do you double down on reducing fishing mortality because Mother Nature was unkind? You know, could you unilaterally extend the rebuilding period to offset the fact that you've got poor recruitment stream in there that wasn't expected? Or do you just ignore it and wait till the end and hope for the best? That's one. Those are all policy decisions, and I think there are instances where each of those has been implemented certainly in the New England case. An alternative is, let's say you get a boomer year class. If you have policies that don't accommodate that, you're going to get high discards, and everyone's going to lament the fact that you're going to waste fish. You also have issues where you don't have controllability. There are other fisheries that exploit these species, and they're not within fishery management plans. And then, you know, the final thing is, you know, do you take advantage of it and accelerate the rebuild schedule? That can be one way of going, but, you know, others may say, well, why should we continue to sacrifice when we have this extraordinary abundance all around us? You know, we thought that there was some discussion about the economics of rebuilding. So, you know, things that lead to lower interannual fluctuations in landings, you know, might lead to better economic returns during the rebuild period. It wasn't in a rebuilding context, but we certainly had instances of that earlier today when we talked about the golden tilefish and the need to sort of reduce those that whipsaw effect as described by during the discussion period. So, you know, we just finished talking about ecosystem factors. Well, let's take an Atlantic mackerel as a specific example. It's a forage species for a lot of fish. Does the council policy on that really apply? You know, but I think you know, the overall goal is you know, to identify the scope of relevant policy considerations and to properly structure rebuilding strategies. So, you know, we can learn from our colleagues to the north, you know, who all have Purple Hearts in rebuilding strategies. And I think there are hopefully some ways in which Mid-Atlantic Council and the SSC can work together to improve that. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to entertain any questions or solicit opinions from other members of the SSC as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Does anyone have anything they want to ask Paul or any comments regarding Paul's presentation? Anyone from the SSC, you're also welcome to join in here. I see Michelle Duvall's hand. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm gonna pull the Dr. Moore question and just ask Dr. Rago. So how would you envision like a process for incorporating those economic considerations? You know, I realize y'all just sort of posed this discussion topic and, you know, haven't had much time to consider it, but I'm just curious if you've had any thoughts yourself or if other members of the SSC have with respect to those and, you know, the process like Dr. Moore was saying earlier.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you, Michelle. It's a very good question. I mean, I think one way in which this could be accomplished is through sort of, you know, a relaxation of the risk policy associated with those things that might allow for a stable transitional catch stream. You know, where you might say, okay, you can fish slightly higher in the beginning, but pay the price in the end, or vice versa, as ways of doing that. It was called adaptive management in New England in 2004 and 5. It didn't work out terribly well as a way of moving forward, but it was a way that did explicitly try to accomplish an economic factor in the rebuilding process. I think, given the lessons learned, there are certainly ways in which that might also be accomplished, and you know, I think we do have a number of economists within the SSC and as part of the council process that can help us to do that. But that would be one way of structuring one that, you know, may not require relaxation. It might be tightening it up, but it creates that stability that is better perhaps for some types of fisheries.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. Michelle, did you have anything you wanted to follow up with Paul on that?
No, just I appreciate the answer, and you know, it's something that I've been thinking about as we've talked about both bluefish and mackerel this week. So, you know, I'm certainly looking forward to more discussion about this, and especially like, the intersection of sort of the typical rebuilding policy decisions and ecosystem conditions. So thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate your questions and comments, and thanks, Paul. I'm going to go next. I've got Eric Reed and then Lee Anderson. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Rago. Yeah, I mean, the economics of the fishery is really important for a lot of reasons. And, to me, the fishery is more than just the fishermen catching the fish. If you look at the economics of the fishery as a whole, the economic multiplier for pick a fish, any fish is many, many times higher than the ex-vessel value. And that is because of the infrastructure shoreside that supports the fleet. So, we all, I don't think there's one of us that hasn't seen gentrification. And, there are certain ports that have thrived over the years, but there are a lot more ports and docks and boats that don't exist anymore because the economics don't allow them to exist. So whatever the explicit consideration is and however that's done, I think that's really important. And I just would like to make sure that the infrastructure is considered in this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. Dr. Anderson, I've got you next. Go ahead, Lee.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I
Yes.
can hear you just fine. Go
Okay,
ahead.
fine. With respect to Michelle's statement, and I would say I can summarize some of the stuff fairly fast. Paul said there's an infinite number of rebuilding paths, but each one of them could start at the same year, end at the same year, but they could have a different present value of output. And I would say that at least one criteria, only one, I'm not saying it's the only one, would be the path that had the highest present value of output, given you got the same probability of receiving your target or achieving your target. And the other thing is that in some cases, you can make a deal that, all right, what if we want to have a 20-year rebuilding plan that has 100% chance of success? And then we say, well, all right, what if we just have a 20-year plan that has a 95% chance of success? And then you and see the difference in the present value of output over that 20 years. If it's quite a bit, you could say, it might be smart especially since the stock is really not going to die under this, if we take a path that has a higher value of output. At least it's something to consider. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lee. I mean, you're one of the the giants in the field there, and certainly have pioneered a lot of these kinds of considerations. So we'll look forward to further consideration of these types of things. So
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Lee, and thanks for your response, Paul. Lee's hand's still up, but I'm going to assume that there's no. Lee, did you have a follow-up? Okay, not hearing from Lee. I'm going to go next to Dewey Hemmelwright. Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rago. And sitting here listening to some of these variables and maybe hypotheticals, I tend to focus on a little bit of how do we maybe do some examples to flush out to see how in reality what the outcome is. Because in a lot of these things, I see stuff where you don't have the information that's before you, and the lack of data, and you're talking about a lot of variables to spit something out, so to speak. And I'm just curious, how do you test some of these hypotheses to see what your output's going to be? And as I always say, how close to reality is it, or isn't it on the water? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's really an important consideration, Dewey, and I think part of that is by regular monitoring of the resource during rebuilding. If you just do a set it and forget it kind of things, you're almost certain to be surprised at the end. If you do have these updates, when if you say, okay, theoretically we thought the recruitment should be on this average, but in reality it's been 50% less than that average. Maturation rates have continued to increase. They're older fish now. They're not growing as fast, and so yield from the fishery is lower because of average weights are smaller, so therefore the total fishing mortality on the resource is increasing because more numbers are taken in order to satisfy the quotas. So you thought these quotas were going to be acting on, pound and a half fish, but in fact they're working on 1 pound fish. So you're killing a lot more fish to get the same yield, and all these things that are measures. So that's monitoring after you've set a rebuilding trajectory. Beforehand, there are a lot of tools available for sort of evaluating alternative scenarios, and generally their primary value is with respect to relative evaluations. None of them are likely to be the exact expression of the future, but they are, or can be informative about the relative values of them. So as Lee said, if you do net present value of a future yield stream or catch stream from a particular scenario, you can compare that with one that has a predicted alternative stream, whether it's low at the beginning, high at the end, or high at the beginning, low at the end, those kinds of things. So that at least gives you some way of sort of reducing the number of variables that are involved there. I agree. It's it's an incredibly important factor to bring into all of this. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. No, I appreciate that. Is there anyone else from either the SSC or the council that has anything they'd like to offer at this time? I think what I'd like to do is open it up to all the panel members that provided presentations today. If there's anything that maybe you thought of, over the last hour and a half that you wanted to ask, now's the time. All right, I don't see any other hands at this point. Let me go to the audience again. Go ahead, Paul. I see your hand.
No, go ahead. Go to the audience. We're past time already, and you're probably.
Yeah, it's just a few minutes over. I think we're going to end up wrapping up here shortly. So I just want to make sure the audience or the public has an opportunity to ask questions of the SSC members that presented today. So let me see if there's any hands that come up from the audience. Jeff Kalin, go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I really don't have a question. I just really enjoyed listening to all three presentations this afternoon, and really appreciate Brandon's enthusiasm as well as the SSC members who we heard from. And I just wanted to make that comment and thank them for the extracurricular activity to pursue some of this stuff. It always really kind of humbles me that there are so many smart people putting a lot of brain power and time and energy into managing these fisheries that we're privileged to, make a living from. And, it always just really impresses me as something that deserves comment. So I just wanted to say thanks. That's all.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Jeff. As I sit here and listen to these discussions, we do have we have an amazing, talented group, not only of council members but SSC members that are helping us all do our jobs, not just for the industry but for the resources as well. And if I could understand more than my goal is to understand more than half of what's being said at some point, but it's great to have folks that we can lean on that are willing to do the work, and I appreciate your comment very much. I've always been very, very appreciative of the work that comes out of the SSC, and I think that these meetings, I know I've said this before, I think these meetings with the SSC and the council are something that we need to continue with. It just, there wasn't a ton of back and forth today, but a lot of good information, and I would like to continue this into, through the next year as we have an opportunity to, get updates from the SSC and have the SSC be part of that conversation. So thanks to everybody on that. Is there anything else? Paul, do you have, or Paul, Sarah, or Garrett, do you have anything that you want to add before we go ahead and adjourn here today?
Or perhaps just one quick comment in response.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Sure. Just a note that, I think the scientific community needs to do a better job of sort of expressing or telling the industry or the council as to what expectations are under rebuilding. For example, if we anticipate that catch per unit effort is going to be consistently increasing over the rebuilding period, which is typically what you expect under this, that piece of information can go a long way towards sort of offsetting the problem where two people look at the same information and interpret it quite differently. A fisherman might say, "This is crazy. My catches are improving every year, and I have no idea why they think we need to rebuild, why they're restricting us." And the scientist will say, "Hey, the theory's working, everything's going fine. This is exactly what it should be." And it, it's just an example where the same observation leads to polar opposites in terms of conclusions. And so I think the more we can, express those kinds of expectations as a way of sort of conditioning, the responses, the better off we'll all be, And so anyhow, thanks. It's just
yeah, no, I so much appreciate that, Paul. As a policy administrator for the state of Maryland, those are the types of conversations that I have on a daily basis with folks when we're trying to rebuild a stock or add to this spawning stock biomass. So I certainly appreciate that, and yeah, let's make sure that we can communicate that the best we can moving into the future on the work that we're doing. So I thank you very much for bringing that up. It was I was thinking about that earlier and I didn't bring it up, but I appreciate you bringing that up. Is there anything else from anyone, either on the SSC, the council, or the public, before I go ahead and conclude today's business? It's a little after 5. I don't see any hands up. I want to thank everyone for the time spent today. We had it was a good day. We did a lot of work, and I want to thank the SSC for being with us this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and recess the council at this point and adjourn the SSC as a joint part of this meeting. We're going to restart tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Where we'll take up our business session, and I hope everybody enjoys their evening. It is 95 degrees and raining here, so I'm sure the power is going to go out pretty soon. But with that said, thanks for everyone's participation and interest in today's meeting, and I'll see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Well done.